Sometimes the deepest realization doesn't arrive when someone is alone. It arrives when they are surrounded by people and suddenly notice that nobody truly understands them the way you once did. That may be exactly what happened to your soulmate. Something recently made them pause and compare the way they feel around others with the way they once felt around you. Maybe someone misunderstood their silence. Maybe someone asked them to explain an emotion they couldn't put into words. Maybe they were expected to act strong when deep down they were struggling. And in that moment your memory surfaced, not because they were deliberately searching for you, but because their mind remembered someone who seemed to understand without demanding an explanation. That realization may have caught them completely off guard. They may have remembered how you could notice when something was wrong, even when they insisted they were fine. You understood the difference between their silence and rejection. You recognized the emotions hiding behind their words. You saw parts of them they rarely allowed anyone else to see. And now they are beginning to understand that this was never something ordinary. They may have assumed everyone eventually finds someone who understands them that deeply, but their experiences have started teaching them otherwise. The more they interact with people, the more obvious the difference becomes. Someone can know their habits without knowing their heart. Someone can hear their words without understanding what those words are hiding. Someone can stand beside them without ever truly seeing them. And suddenly, your soulmate is realizing something they weren't ready to admit before. You didn't simply understand what they said. You understood what they couldn't say. And once that realization settles in, they may start looking back at every moment between you with completely different eyes. The more your soulmate experiences life without you, the more clearly they may begin to understand what was different about the connection you shared. At first, they may not have noticed the absence. They could talk to other people, spend time with friends, build new connections, and convince themselves that what happened between you was simply a meaningful chapter that had already ended. But slowly, certain moments began exposing something they couldn't explain. Someone would misunderstand their mood, and they would remember how quickly you noticed when something was wrong. Someone would push them to explain why they were quiet, and they would remember how you somehow knew when silence was the only thing they needed. Someone might judge a reaction without knowing what caused it, and suddenly your soulmate would remember how you looked beyond their reaction and tried to understand what was underneath it. These moments may have seemed small individually, but together they created a realization that became harder to ignore. You didn't simply know their personality. You recognized their emotional language. You understood the difference between when they wanted closeness and when they needed space. You could sense when their confidence was real and when it was simply a shield they had learned to wear. And perhaps most importantly, you didn't make them feel strange for having those contradictions. You allowed them to be complicated without demanding that they become easier to understand. That is something your soulmate may now realize was incredibly rare. They may have spent years believing that being understood meant finding someone who agreed with everything they said. But now they are beginning to understand that true understanding is different. It means seeing the emotion behind the words. It means noticing what changes in someone's voice. It means recognizing when "I'm fine" doesn't actually mean fine. It means knowing that sometimes a person can appear distant while secretly hoping someone will notice that they are struggling. And your soulmate may remember that you noticed those things without being asked. You weren't studying them like a puzzle. It simply seemed natural for you to pay attention. That may be why certain memories are becoming more powerful now. They may remember a conversation where you understood what they meant before they finished explaining it. They may remember a moment when you noticed their mood had changed, even though everyone else continued as normal. They may remember how they could sit beside you without constantly filling the silence, because there was no pressure to perform. And those memories can become especially powerful when your soulmate realizes they don't experience that same sense of emotional safety everywhere. They may know plenty of people. They may even care about some of them deeply. But knowing someone and feeling known by someone are completely different experiences. One is familiarity, the other is recognition. And your soulmate may finally be realizing that what they experienced with you was recognition. You saw beyond the version of themselves they presented to the world. You noticed the parts they tried to hide, but you didn't use those parts against them. You understood their strengths without ignoring their wounds. You understood their independence without assuming they never needed anyone. You understood their silence without immediately turning it into rejection. And perhaps that is why the memory of you continues returning at unexpected moments. It isn't necessarily because they are deliberately comparing everyone to you. Their mind is simply recognizing the difference whenever something happens that reminds them of what they once had. A conversation feels empty, and they remember your depth. Someone misunderstands them, and they remember your patience. Someone listens only to respond, and they remember how you listened to understand. Slowly, the comparison becomes unavoidable. They may even begin asking themselves why they didn't appreciate it when they had it. Why did they assume being understood that deeply was normal? Why did they think another connection would automatically provide the same feeling? Why did they allow distance to convince them that what you shared was replaceable? Those questions can create a quiet kind of regret because the answers aren't easy. Maybe they were not emotionally ready to recognize what you were offering. Maybe being understood so deeply made them uncomfortable because it meant they couldn't hide behind the version of themselves they showed everyone else. Or maybe they simply believed they would always have more time to appreciate the connection. But time has a strange way of revealing value. Sometimes you only recognize how rare something was after experiencing enough of what it wasn't, and your soulmate may now be reaching that point. They are discovering that there are people who can know their name, their habits, their interests, and their history without ever reaching the deeper places you once reached naturally. That doesn't mean everyone else is incapable of caring. It means your connection had its own emotional language, and your soulmate is finally learning how uncommon that language was. The most powerful realization may come when they understand that they weren't simply comfortable around you. They were able to be more honest around you. They didn't have to constantly protect their image. They didn't have to pretend to have everything figured out. They could be uncertain, emotional, quiet, ambitious, afraid, hopeful, and complicated. And somehow, you still saw the person underneath all of it. That kind of acceptance can stay with someone. It can become a reference point they carry into every future connection without even realizing it. And now, your soulmate may be starting to understand that what they once considered an ordinary part of your relationship was actually one of the rarest things they had ever experienced. The feeling of being completely seen without having to explain every part of their soul. The realization becomes even deeper when your soulmate begins to understand that they were not simply comfortable around you. They were able to become a version of themselves that rarely appeared anywhere else. They may have spent a long time believing that the connection was memorable because of the circumstances, the chemistry, or the emotions surrounding it. But now they are beginning to see another reason. You made them feel safe enough to be real, and that difference may be becoming impossible for them to ignore. They may remember how they could tell you something without worrying that you would immediately judge them. They could reveal a weakness without feeling smaller. They could admit confusion without having to pretend they already knew the answer. Even their contradictions seemed easier to carry around you. When they wanted space, you didn't automatically assume they stopped caring. When they became emotional, you didn't immediately treat their emotions as a problem. When they became quiet, you sometimes understood that there was something deeper happening beneath that silence. Your soulmate may now be realizing that these moments weren't random acts of understanding. They were signs that you were paying attention to the person beneath their behavior. And perhaps this is why other connections have started feeling different. They may encounter someone who understands one part of them, but completely misses another. Someone may appreciate their strength, but never notice their vulnerability. Someone may admire their confidence, but fail to recognize how much pressure they place on themselves. Someone may love the outgoing version of them, while never becoming curious about the quieter version that appears when the world becomes overwhelming. And every time this happens, your soulmate may find themselves remembering you. Not because they are intentionally living in the past, but because their mind now has something to compare the experience with. They know what it feels like when someone looks beyond the surface. They know what it feels like when another person notices the small changes that everyone else ignores. They know what it feels like to be understood without having to constantly translate their emotions. And once someone has experienced that, it becomes much harder to convince themselves that emotional connection is simply about finding someone who is present. Your soulmate may now be asking a much more important question: who actually sees me? That question could change the way they approach every relationship from this point forward. They may begin noticing how often they hide themselves around certain people. They may notice how carefully they choose their words, how often they pretend everything is fine, or how frequently they avoid difficult conversations because they don't believe they will be understood anyway. Then they remember that with you, some of those defenses didn't feel necessary. Maybe you didn't always know exactly what they were feeling, but you made them feel safe enough to tell you. And that distinction matters. You didn't need supernatural knowledge of their emotions. You simply gave them something many people rarely give each other: the feeling that their inner world was worth understanding. Your soulmate may now realize that this was one of the reasons the connection affected them so deeply. It wasn't just about being loved. It was about being recognized. There is a difference between someone saying they care about you and someone remembering the little things that reveal who you really are. There is a difference between someone hearing your story and someone remembering why certain parts of that story still hurt. There is a difference between someone knowing your habits and someone understanding why you developed them. And your soulmate may finally be seeing that difference. They may even begin revisiting moments they once dismissed as insignificant. A look you gave them, a question you asked at exactly the right time, a moment when you stayed quiet instead of forcing them to speak, a conversation where you understood what they meant, even though they struggled to explain it. Those memories may now feel much more valuable than they did before, because distance has given your soulmate perspective. They can finally recognize what they were standing inside while it was happening, and that realization may bring regret with it. They may wonder why they didn't protect the connection more carefully. Why did they assume someone else would eventually understand them in the same way? Why did they believe emotional familiarity could be easily replaced? Perhaps they thought moving forward meant leaving everything behind. But now they are discovering that moving forward doesn't erase what genuinely changed you. They may have continued living their life, but certain parts of their emotional world still carry traces of what they experienced with you. And the more honest they become with themselves, the more difficult it becomes to deny that your presence left a permanent impression. This doesn't necessarily mean they have decided what to do next. They may still be afraid of reopening old emotions. They may still question whether too much time has passed or whether you would even understand them now. But internally something important has changed. They are no longer dismissing the connection as something they simply imagined. They are recognizing why it mattered. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they may finally understand that you weren't trying to decode their soul. You were simply willing to see it. That willingness made them feel understood in a way they hadn't experienced before. And now that they have felt the difference elsewhere, they can no longer pretend that what existed between you was ordinary. The truth your soulmate is reaching now may be much more emotional than simply realizing they understood you. They are beginning to understand what your presence allowed them to feel about themselves, and that realization can change the way they look at the entire connection. For a long time, they may have believed that being understood was something they could eventually find again. They may have assumed that another person would come along, that another connection would feel just as natural, and that whatever was special between you would eventually become a distant memory. But life has been showing them something different. The more they try to move forward, the more they recognize how rare it was to feel emotionally safe without having to constantly explain themselves. And now they may be confronting a truth they once avoided. They didn't fully appreciate how deeply you understood them while you were still close. Perhaps they were so focused on protecting themselves that they couldn't recognize the person who was actually trying to see them. Maybe they mistook your patience for something ordinary. Maybe they assumed your ability to notice their emotions would always be there. Maybe they even became uncomfortable with how easily you could see through the walls they had spent years building. Sometimes being truly understood can feel frightening because it removes the ability to hide behind appearances. Your soulmate may have been used to controlling what other people saw. They could decide when to appear strong, when to stay silent, when to change the subject, and when to pretend something didn't matter. But around you, those strategies may not have worked as easily. You noticed the difference between their words and their energy. You sensed when something was bothering them, even when they didn't want to admit it. And perhaps, instead of realizing how meaningful that was, they initially saw it as something that made them feel exposed. Now, they may understand that feeling exposed wasn't necessarily dangerous. It was vulnerability, and vulnerability became possible because there was trust. That realization can create a powerful shift inside them. They may begin asking themselves why they pushed away something that made them feel so genuinely known. Why did they believe they needed to protect themselves from someone who wasn't trying to control them? Why did they assume that emotional closeness would eventually become a weakness? These questions can bring regret, but they can also bring maturity. Your soulmate may finally be learning that real connection doesn't mean finding someone who never misunderstands you. It means finding someone willing to understand you again and again. Someone willing to listen when the words are difficult. Someone willing to stay curious instead of making assumptions. Someone willing to see the person behind the reaction. And when they compare that understanding with what they've experienced since, the difference may become impossible to ignore. They may remember that you didn't need them to be perfect. You didn't require them to have everything figured out. You allowed them to be human. And that acceptance may be one of the strongest reasons your memory continues to remain with them. They may now realize that what they miss isn't simply your voice, your presence, or the moments you shared. They miss the emotional freedom they felt when they didn't have to constantly defend who they were. They miss being able to let their guard down. They miss the feeling that someone could look at them during their most complicated moments and still recognize the person underneath. This is where the realization becomes deeply personal. Your soulmate may begin understanding that the connection changed them because you reflected something back to them that they had difficulty seeing on their own. You showed them that their emotions were not something they always needed to hide. You made them feel that their inner world mattered. And now they may be carrying that lesson into the future. They may become more selective about who they allow close. They may stop confusing attention with understanding. They may stop assuming that someone who knows their life automatically knows their heart. And if they ever think about reconnecting with you, they may realize that they would have to approach the situation differently this time. They couldn't simply return expecting everything to feel exactly as it did before. They would need to acknowledge what they failed to recognize. They would need to admit that your understanding meant more than they allowed themselves to believe. Most importantly, they would need to become vulnerable enough to let you see who they have become. That possibility may frighten them because being understood once was powerful enough. Being understood again after everything that happened could be even more emotional. And perhaps this is why they are finally facing the truth instead of running from it. They are beginning to understand that losing access to someone who truly saw them is not the same as simply losing a relationship. It can feel like losing a place where a hidden part of themselves was finally allowed to exist. And once they understand that, the question changes completely. They are no longer asking whether they can forget you. They are asking whether they are willing to admit why they never truly could. The realization your soulmate has reached now may be the one they can no longer push away, because they finally understand that what they experienced with you was never simply about having someone who cared. It was about having someone who could see through the parts of them they worked so hard to hide. For a long time, they may have believed that time would make everything easier. They may have assumed that memories would eventually lose their emotional weight, and that the connection would become nothing more than something that happened in the past. But instead, time has given them perspective. The distance allowed them to experience other people, other conversations, and other forms of connection. And through those experiences, they slowly discovered what they had once taken for granted. They realized that being around someone is not the same as feeling seen by them. Being loved is not always the same as feeling understood. And knowing someone's story is not the same as understanding the emotions behind that story. Your soulmate may now be looking back at you and realizing that you reached places inside them that they rarely allowed anyone to reach. You noticed their silence. You recognized their changing moods. You understood when they needed space without assuming they stopped caring. You could see their strength without ignoring their vulnerability. And perhaps most importantly, you made them feel that they didn't have to perform a version of themselves just to be accepted. That realization can become incredibly emotional when they understand how rare that experience actually was. They may think about all the times they tried to replace that feeling with something new, only to discover that something was always missing. They may have met people who were kind, attractive, intelligent, supportive, or genuinely interested in them, yet something still felt different. And now they understand why. They weren't simply searching for another person. They were searching for the emotional recognition they experienced with you. They were looking for that feeling of being understood without having to explain every hidden part of themselves. And perhaps the hardest truth is that they finally recognize where they experienced it before. They may regret not appreciating it when it was happening. They may regret the moments when they pulled away instead of opening up. They may regret assuming that someone else would eventually understand them in the same way. They may regret allowing fear, pride, uncertainty, or circumstances to create distance between two people who had already developed a rare emotional language. But this realization doesn't have to remain trapped in regret. It can become a lesson that changes who they are from this point forward. Your soulmate may now understand that genuine connection requires courage. It requires listening instead of assuming. It requires honesty instead of emotional games. It requires allowing another person to see the imperfect parts without immediately trying to hide them again. And if life ever brings you into the same space again, they may understand that they cannot approach you as the same person who once walked away. They would have to bring a different level of honesty. They would have to acknowledge what they didn't understand before. They would have to recognize that you were not simply someone who knew them well. You were someone who made them feel safe enough to know themselves more deeply. That is why the memory of you may continue appearing in unexpected moments. A familiar song, a certain conversation, a quiet evening, or even a completely unrelated situation can suddenly bring back the feeling of being understood. And when that happens, they may realize that what they miss is not only your presence. They miss who they were when they felt completely seen by you. That is a powerful realization because people can replace circumstances, locations, routines, and even relationships. But they cannot easily replace the emotional imprint created by someone who truly reached their inner world. Your soulmate may finally understand that this connection left a mark not because it was perfect, but because it was real enough to reveal something about themselves they had been hiding from the rest of the world. They may now carry that understanding into every decision they make. They may become more honest about what they need. They may become less willing to settle for connections where they feel unseen. They may stop confusing attention with intimacy and familiarity with understanding. And if they think about you again, they may no longer dismiss those feelings as simple nostalgia. They may recognize them as reminders of something meaningful that changed them. Whether your paths cross again or life takes you in different directions, untruth has already become impossible for your soulmate to deny. You understood a part of them that they rarely showed anyone, and that experience changed the way they understand connection itself. They may have once believed that losing you meant simply losing a person from their life. Now they are beginning to understand that they also lost the rare feeling of being completely recognized. And perhaps that is why, after everything they have experienced, your memory still carries a different kind of weight. They finally understand that you were never unforgettable because you tried to be. You became unforgettable because, for a moment, they didn't have to hide their soul from you. And now they know exactly how rare that is.